Here's a clip of Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson talking about the lessons of the Holocaust.
In our age, you hear people all the time saying things like the lessons of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
So what are you talking about? Which lessons? And generally, it devolves into kind of banality of like, be nice to people. Like, don't mass murder people. Sure. Okay.
Right.
Beyond that.
Right.
And
the devil's in the details, unfortunately.
In the details on this. In fact, by the way, it's very hard to say anything new about Auschwitz. And you sort of feel everything has been said that could be said in a way. And at the same time, we know nothing about it. But I was very struck. Martin Amis, who died recently, wrote a novel in the 90s. It was very controversial at the time, called Time's Arrow. Everything goes backwards. The whole plot of the novel goes, time is reversed. So if somebody is sick, they go to a pile of sick and inhale it and then walk happily around their day. So it's a device that works well at times as an abusive parent. The child is crying, the parent smacks the child and he stops crying. It's a device that makes you able to look at things in an interesting way. But he was much criticized for Amis in the 90s because he does the Holocaust. He addresses the Holocaust in the book. And everyone said, oh, you're using it as a literary device. I actually think by doing what he did, he actually showed one of the very few new insights I've ever seen about the Holocaust, which is that the people whose job it is to take the bodies out of the ovens would give birth to these people from the ovens. Late in the novel, one of them confides to one of his colleagues that he's getting nervous because the people that they're bringing out of the ovens now don't seem right. They're more and more disabled. They're more and more ill. Is it worth even taking them out of the ovens? So strangely enough, by doing it in reverse, you get an idea of how it started.
Right.
You get an idea of how it started.
Yeah, well, the thing is terrible things start one thing at a time. Right?
And in this case, again, by a desire on behalf of some people to alleviate suffering or to
claim to
alleviate suffering, to view some lives as less valued than others, perhaps hardly worth living, goes back to what we were saying about Canada today. To view, I urge people to think of it this way round, because if you think about it this way round, it's much easier to see how you start. But the other thing,
that is how things started in Nazi Germany too, right? Is that because the progression towards the death camps was a progression through euthanasia. And I've looked at a fair number of the propaganda films from the mid-30s where the Nazis were starting to clean up the asylums, and they would go in and like I've been in backward asylums when I worked at the Douglas Hospital in the 1980s. There were still people there who had been on the wards, who hadn't been deinstitutionalized, who had been on the wards for like 4 decades. And they would kind of lurk in the corridors that were underground at the Douglas Hospital because it was like a university campus that was connected by underground passageways. And it was like Dante's Inferno down there. I mean, and you could easily go there and make the case that, oh my God, is a life of being on a backward in a psychiatric hospital, wrapped up in a straitjacket for 3 decades, worth living. And well, that brings that whole terrible conundrum up in front of you. And there's no simple answer you can jump to there. But one of the answers, the answer that is something that should therefore be handed to the state to deal with in some efficient manner, that's definitely not a good.
But the idea that it's a question that the individual should wrestle with is naturally the case. I mean, that this is something that people should think about and will always think about as long as people think. It seems to me very obvious. I've always been struck by one of Elie Wiesel's works, who was, of course, in Auschwitz. I don't know if you know The Trial of God. Did you ever read that one?
No.
It's worth reading, and there's a version of it he replays in another of his books. I think the Gates of the Forest called. There's anyhow, it was something that I think Wiesel saw in Auschwitz, but there was a night where in the camp they have some rabbis who decide that they will put God on trial, and Wiesel describes it in extraordinary detail, and it's riveting. The silence in the room, and eventually the case for the prosecution, the case for the defense, given by very, very learned rabbis from Poland, and nobody could know more than these men routinely knew, which is a reminder of what was lost. But in the end, they find God guilty.
See, the Jews never did that in the Old Testament.
Well, no, but then something very important happens.
Okay.
Which is that they find God guilty, and there's a silence in the heart, and they realize what they've done. And then somebody says, one of the rabbis says, okay, it's Friday night, we need to go and do our prayers. And they do.
That's kind of reminiscent of what happens in the Grand Inquisitor.
Yes, exactly.
When the Inquisitor leaves the door open for Christ, right? Even though he's doomed him to, hypothetically, to death because he's no longer necessary.
All right, so I think the main point here is, especially in the beginning, they were discussing that, in case you were completely lost, they were basically discussing that people do terrible things out of empathy. So you can feel really bad for someone and therefore want to save them from their misery, save them from their wretched state, because you view them as such a lowly creature, and you look at it like if you eliminate them in a brutal manner, at least they won't have to live with the wretched being that they are. And this is almost similar to, this Islamic idea of making infidels into worshipers, making disbelievers into followers of Islam, and the need for that, because the disbelievers are living such terrible lives, and they need to be saved by Allah. They need to be saved by this religion. And it can get very dangerous if you start to impose your religion on other people. You can get to a place where you're really, committing terrible atrocities in the name of empathy. And he's saying that you saw that during the Holocaust, where they looked at it like they were doing these terrible, evil acts for a greater good. And I'm sure at some point they realized that they were just doing evil acts, but perhaps it was too late. For more, subscribe to the channel. If you want to help us make more of these videos, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/JewishUncensored. Thank you, and have a good one.